In a society that blindly defers to authority, the injustices we reveal are nothing short of an affront to our very humanity. This is not a polite critique. It's a searing indictment of a system that thrives on oppression and abuse of power. Today, we expose the raw, unfiltered fury of those silenced by corruption. Prepare to be outraged, because the truth we unveil is the spark that will ignite a revolution against tyranny. A heavy, humid evening draped the city of Atlanta in a cloak of both beauty and tension. The streets buzzed with the rhythmic pulse of urban life, horns honking, neon lights flickering, and the murmurs of countless stories unfolding in parallel. At the heart of this living mosaic was Ava Walker, a dedicated and respected chief federal prosecutor whose name resonated with determination and an unyielding pursuit of justice. Her reputation, built over years of relentless service, shone like a beacon against the backdrop of systemic corruption and complacency. Ava had just concluded a series of high-stakes meetings at the Atlas Justice Center, a modern, glass-fronted edifice that symbolized both the promise and the pitfalls of the legal system. As she drove along the busy avenues, her mind was already busy processing the complexities of her day. A day filled with intricate legal debates, sensitive discussions about civil rights, and the heavy burden of protecting the vulnerable. The soft strains of a soulful blues melody hummed through her car speakers, a personal ritual that helped her center her thoughts and steady her resolve in a world that was all too often unpredictable. Yet, on this particular evening, fate was about to conspire against her in a way that would test her mettle like never before. In the midst of her quiet contemplation, Ava noticed a flashing blue light in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat as the unmistakable sound of a police siren grew louder, slicing through the serenity of her reflective moment. With a mixture of apprehension and the calm of someone who had weathered countless storms, she signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. Moments later, Officer Cole, a man whose uniform and demeanor radiated authority and, as time would reveal, a troubling arrogance, stepped out of his patrol car. His boots clicked authoritatively against the pavement, a sound that echoed in the cool evening air. The officer's eyes, filled with a mixture of suspicion and condescension, locked onto Ava's calm, composed figure through the open window. "License and registration," he barked curtly, his tone carrying an air of impatience that belied the routine nature of the stop. Ava, ever the embodiment of poise, reached for her documents with measured grace. "Good evening, officer. May I ask what the reason for this stop is?" she inquired, her voice steady and respectful despite the undercurrent of unease that prickled at her senses. Officer Cole's gaze flicked briefly over her face and then to the neatly stacked documents on the passenger seat. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the papers, a smirk slowly creeping across his face. "Do you know how fast you were going?" he asked, his tone dripping with a condescension that suggested he was far more interested in asserting his dominance than in upholding the law. Ava's mind raced back to countless stories of routine traffic stops that had spiraled into unjust confrontations, often fueled by prejudiced assumptions and the unchecked exercise of power. She had seen victims, innocent people, being reduced to mere statistics by officers who seemed to relish the power imbalance. Today, however, fate had cast her in the role of the victim, and despite her status, she was not immune to the dynamics of authority gone awry. "I was within the limit," Ava replied calmly, her tone underscored with a quiet firmness that hinted at the resilience honed by years of facing injustice head-on. "Is there something else I should be aware of?" Officer Cole's eyes sparkled with a mix of irritation and self-satisfaction. He stepped closer to the vehicle, his presence becoming increasingly imposing. "You seem awfully defensive for someone pulled over," he remarked, a sneer twisting his lips as he leaned in, invading the personal space that Ava had always considered sacrosanct. Ava felt a cold shiver ripple down her spine. Although she maintained her outward composure, her inner thoughts swirled with a mix of indignation and the bitter irony of her situation. Here she was, a pillar of legal integrity, reduced to being treated like any ordinary citizen, vulnerable to the whims of an officer intoxicated by his own sense of superiority. Every fiber of her being resonated with the injustice of the moment, Yet she knew that any display of overt emotion could be exploited to justify further aggression. Without further explanation, Officer Cole's hand shot out, seizing Ava's wrist with a force that belied the routine nature of the stop. The cold, unyielding metal of the handcuffs bit into her skin as they snapped shut around her wrist. A shocking reminder that even those who wield the law can sometimes become its violators. The sudden escalation left Ava momentarily breathless, her mind processing the absurdity of being restrained while fully compliant with the officer's requests. "This is unnecessary," she murmured under her breath, though her tone remained measured. "I have done nothing wrong." But Officer Cole's smirk only deepened, his eyes alight with a dangerous cocktail of hubris and entitlement. "The only mistake here is thinking you can question the process," he retorted, his voice loud enough to attract the curious glances of passing pedestrians. His tone, laced with unwarranted authority, revealed his deep-seated belief that he was above reproach, a belief that, in that very moment, was about to be spectacularly challenged. As Ava was forced from her car and escorted towards the waiting patrol cruiser, the world around her seemed to slow down. Every detail, the flickering streetlights, the distant murmur of urban life, even the murmur of her own heartbeat, merged into a single, overwhelming tableau of injustice. The cool evening air, once soothing and serene, now carried the acrid scent of tension and the bitter taste of indignation. In that moment, as the patrol car's door closed behind her, Ava's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She had dedicated her life to fighting against abuses of power, to defending those who could not defend themselves. Yet here she was, subjected to the very same indignity she had spent years condemning. Her thoughts turned to the countless stories of injustice that she had encountered in her career, each one a haunting reminder of the fragility of justice when in the hands of those blinded by their own authority. Inside the cruiser, the confined space seemed to amplify the cold reality of her situation. Officer Cole's casual demeanor, the way he chatted with his colleagues, as if her arrest were a trivial matter, made Ava's heart sink. Despite the sting of humiliation, a fierce determination began to kindle within her, a resolve that had been the cornerstone of her career. She knew that this incident was not merely an isolated affront to her dignity. It was a microcosm of a larger, deeply ingrained system of corruption and abuse. Every so often, as the cruiser rumbled towards the police station, Ava's mind drifted back to the moments leading up to the stop. The way the sirens had shattered the quiet, the sudden rush of adrenaline that had surged through her veins, and the stark realization that even those sworn to uphold the law were capable of subjugating the very people they were meant to protect. In those reflections lay a profound sorrow, a mourning for the lost trust between the community and those entrusted with its safety. Yet, amid the sorrow, there was also a spark of defiance. Ava had always believed in the transformative power of accountability. The very system that now restrained her would one day be compelled to reckon with its own failings. Her calm, measured responses were not a sign of submission but a prelude to a storm that was gathering strength. A storm that would soon sweep away the arrogance and prejudice that had marred this very institution. As the patrol cruiser finally pulled up to the precinct, Ava's mind was already formulating her next steps. The unjust arrest was a stark violation of her rights, an affront not only to her dignity, but to the principles of fairness and justice that she had vowed to defend. The officer's brazen misuse of power, his casual disregard for the truth, had not gone unnoticed. It would become the catalyst for a battle that transcended her own personal humiliation, a battle for the integrity of an entire system. Standing before the intimidating facade of the police station, the weight of the day's events pressed upon her like a physical force. With every step she took towards the building, the cold steel of the handcuffs reminded her of the day's grim lesson. Power, when unchecked, corrupts absolutely. But Ava also knew that she was not alone. The voices of the silenced, the stories of those wronged by such abuse, echoed in her heart and gave her the strength to press forward. In that poignant moment, as the station doors loomed large before her, Ava's eyes burned with a fierce determination. The injustice she had endured would not be allowed to fade into silence. She would channel her pain, her anger, and her resolute commitment to justice into a force that could no longer be ignored. Her arrest was merely the opening act in a saga that would challenge the very foundations of systemic abuse, and she was ready to stand at its forefront. As the precinct's corridors swallowed her up, each step resonated with a promise. A promise that the battle for accountability was just beginning, and that one day, every voice that had been stifled by injustice would be heard. The calm before the storm was fleeting, but in that fleeting moment, Ava Walker embraced the full spectrum of her emotions. Humiliation, indignation, sorrow, and an unyielding spark of hope. What do you think Ava felt most acutely in that moment? Anger, determination, or sorrow? Share your thoughts below. The following morning, the city of Atlanta was draped in a mist of early light that hinted at both hope and foreboding. After the tumultuous events of the previous evening, Ava Walker found herself standing before the imposing facade of the Fulton County Courthouse, a modern structure built to embody the ideals of justice, yet today, it would serve as the stage for a showdown that would shake its very foundations. Inside the cavernous courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The polished wood panels, high ceilings, and muted colors did little to mask the tension that vibrated in the air. Rows of benches were filled with curious onlookers. Journalists, legal professionals, community members, and even a few disillusioned officers whose eyes flickered with a mix of apprehension and hidden hope. In this charged environment, every whispered comment and shifting gaze underscored the knowledge that the proceedings would be far from routine. At the front of the room, beneath a lofty stained glass window that cast vibrant patterns of colored light upon the courtroom floor, sat Judge Miranda Ross, a woman of formidable presence, whose reputation for impartiality and unwavering commitment to the truth was known throughout the legal community. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat chignon, and her gaze, piercing yet thoughtful, seemed to weigh every detail before her. Even the trial had commenced. Ava, dignified despite the lingering sting of the previous night's ordeal, walked slowly toward the defendant's table. Each step was measured, her heels echoing with a resolute rhythm that spoke of determination and latent power. Across the aisle, Officer Cole sat at the defendant's table, his posture a stark contrast to Ava's composure. Gone was the earlier bravado. Now, his expression was clouded with anxiety, a subtle crack in the facade of his self-assured authority. The proceedings began with a low murmur as the courtroom settled into an uneasy silence. Judge Ross called the court to order, her voice calm yet imbued with authority. "This court is now in session," she announced, her tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. Today, every word would be scrutinized, every gesture weighed, and every claim verified. The prosecution's lead attorney, representing the interests of justice and bolstered by Ava's own remarkable presence, stepped forward to present the case. With a measured cadence, the attorney recounted the events of the previous night, how Ava had been pulled over under dubious pretenses, how Officer Cole's demeanor had escalated the situation, and how the handcuffs had been applied with a needless aggression that bordered on abuse. Ava listened intently, her face composed but her eyes reflecting the storm of emotions within. As the narrative unfolded, it became clear that the confrontation was not merely about a routine traffic stop gone awry. It was about the misuse of power, the erosion of trust, and the deep-seated issues that plagued the institution entrusted with public safety. Every detail, from the shrill sound of the siren to the chilling cold of the metal cuffs, was recounted with clinical precision yet carried the weight of lived experience. When it was Ava's turn to speak, the courtroom hushed to a profound silence. Rising slowly, she walked to the witness stand with the poise of someone who had weathered many storms. She began not with anger, but with a calm declaration of truth. "Your Honor, members of the court," Ava started, her voice steady and clear, "I stand before you not as an adversary of the law, but as its fervent advocate. What I experienced last night was not only an infringement of my rights, but a manifestation of a systemic problem that threatens the very foundation of justice." Her words resonated deeply. With each sentence, she drew the audience into her personal battle, each word a testament to the countless hours spent championing the cause of the oppressed, each pause laden with the weight of a shared history of neglect and abuse. Her gaze swept over the courtroom, connecting with those who had long suffered in silence and those who had been eager for change. As Ava detailed the encounter, The dismissive sneer of Officer Cole, the arbitrary application of force, and the unwarranted humiliation inflicted upon her. Her tone evolved from calm explanation to passionate indictment. "We must ask ourselves," she continued, "how many more will be subjected to such indignities before the system is compelled to reform itself? How many voices must be silenced? How many stories left untold? Before we recognize that accountability cannot be optional." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Some faces, previously masked in skepticism, now reflected empathy and shared determination. Even a few of the courtroom's officials exchanged glances that hinted at the possibility of long overdue change. Officer Cole's discomfort grew more pronounced as Ava's testimony unfolded. His earlier confidence, once bolstered by the implicit authority of his badge, now crumbled under the weight of undeniable evidence. His earlier smirk had been replaced by a look of anxiety, a silent acknowledgement that the scales of justice were beginning to tip in an unexpected direction. Then, as if to punctuate the gravity of the moment, Judge Ross interjected with a probing question. "Officer Cole, can you explain why your account of the events diverges so markedly from the evidence presented and the eyewitness testimonies?" Her words were measured, yet they carried the unmistakable weight of inquiry, a challenge that Officer Cole could no longer deflect with empty rhetoric. Caught off guard, Officer Cole fumbled for a response. His words were hesitant, his usual bravado replaced by an air of vulnerability that was entirely unfamiliar in his previous displays of authority. I followed standard procedure," he stammered, his voice wavering as he attempted to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his grasp. "I merely did what I believed was necessary to enforce the law." The courtroom fell into a pregnant silence. Ava's eyes locked onto his, her expression unreadable yet filled with quiet resolve. The unspoken tension between them spoke volumes. The discrepancy between the letter of the law and its actual execution had been laid bare, and it was now a matter for all present to reckon with. Judge Ross leaned forward, her expression stern yet fair. "Enforcement of the law must always be tempered with respect for the rights of all citizens," she declared. "When the tool of justice becomes an instrument of oppression, we must take notice." Her words reverberated in the hallowed space, leaving no doubt that the scales were shifting. For a long, drawn-out moment, the courtroom existed in a state of suspended animation. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Would Officer Cole be held accountable for his actions? Could Ava's unwavering determination bring about the long-sought reforms that many had dreamed of? And, perhaps most importantly, was this the turning point where justice would triumph over systemic abuse? In that moment of profound stillness, Ava allowed herself a brief pause, a silent nod to the countless individuals who had borne the brunt of a flawed system. The faces in the crowd, their expressions a mosaic of hope, sorrow, and determination, mirrored her inner resolve. Every word she had spoken, every nuance of her testimony, had been a rallying cry for change, a call to arms for those who had long been marginalized by a system meant to protect them. As the proceedings continued, the evidence against Officer Cole mounted inexorably. Surveillance footage, corroborated by multiple eyewitness accounts, painted a picture of a man who had, in his arrogance, overstepped the bounds of acceptable conduct. The prosecution presented expert testimonies that dissected the sequence of events with surgical precision, leaving little room for alternative interpretations. Each new piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of the narrative that had once shielded his misconduct. By the time the final witness was called, the courtroom's atmosphere had transformed from one of quiet expectation to charged determination. The jurors, who had been attentively absorbing every detail, now exchanged glances that spoke of a collective understanding, a recognition that this case was more than just a single incident. It was emblematic of a much larger struggle for fairness and dignity. In her closing argument, Ava's voice resonated with the power of truth and the unyielding demand for accountability. "Today, we stand at the crossroads of justice," she proclaimed. "This case is not merely about one officer's actions. It is a mirror reflecting the broader failures of our system. Let it be known that the abuse of power, no matter how subtle or overt, will no longer be tolerated." The rights of the citizen, the sanctity of the law, and the promise of justice must prevail. Her words stirred the hearts of those in attendance. There was a palpable sense that something monumental was unfolding, a moment that could redefine the boundaries of accountability in a society long marred by institutional complacency. As Judge Ross prepared to render her judgment, a hush fell over the courtroom, as if time itself were holding its breath. In that suspended moment, each individual present felt the weight of a history fraught with injustice and the dawning promise of a future where such transgressions might finally be curtailed. How do you think the courtroom's atmosphere and the evidence presented will influence the final judgment in this case? Share your thoughts. In the quiet aftermath of the courtroom showdown, the air in Atlanta still vibrated with the echoes of that fateful day. While many in the courtroom had left with a renewed sense of hope and justice, Ava Walker knew that the battle was far from over. The trial had exposed the gross misconduct of Officer Cole, but it had also unveiled cracks in a system that had long shielded not only him but many others who exploited their positions of power. Determined to peel back the layers of corruption, Ava embarked on an investigation that would test her resolve and redefine her purpose. The next morning, as the sun's early rays filtered through the tall windows of her modest yet organized office at the Atlas Justice Center, Ava sat at her desk with a stack of documents and internal memos. Her eyes, still lingering with the intensity of her testimony, now scanned pages of disciplinary reports, incident logs, and complaints, each one a fragment of a much larger narrative of systemic abuse. There was a steady rhythm to her work as she methodically reviewed every detail, her mind piecing together a puzzle that many had long ignored. Among the files, one name reappeared with alarming frequency: Sergeant Mitchell Gray, the supervisor responsible for overseeing Officer Cole's unit. Gray's record was not marked by exemplary leadership or integrity. Instead, Ava discovered numerous instances where complaints against his officers were brushed aside, dismissed with cursory explanations that reeked of negligence. With each new document, her anger and determination grew. Here was evidence of a culture that not only tolerated misconduct but actively concealed it, a culture built on the silent complicity of those sworn to protect the law. Late into the afternoon, as the office lights hummed softly against the backdrop of Atlanta's skyline, Ava made her first decisive move. She drafted a detailed memorandum addressed to the Department of Justice's Internal Affairs Division, outlining her findings and urging a comprehensive audit of Sergeant Gray's unit. Her fingers danced over the keyboard, each word imbued with the conviction of someone who had seen too much injustice. With a deep breath, she pressed send and allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction, knowing that this was a crucial step in exposing the rot within the system. Yet, even as she initiated this formal complaint, the investigation took on a more personal dimension. Ava recalled the faces of those who had silently suffered from unchecked power, the tearful accounts of families torn apart by wrongful detentions, the whispered stories of neighbors who had lost trust in law enforcement. Determined to give voice to these unheard narratives, she reached out to a network of community activists and legal aid organizations. In the ensuing days, a series of confidential meetings were arranged. At a modest community center tucked away in one of Atlanta's diverse neighborhoods, Ava met with local advocates and former victims who had long been marginalized by the system's indifference. One meeting in particular left an indelible mark on her. In a small, windowlit room, a young woman named Jasmine recounted her experience of being harassed during a routine traffic stop, a stop that had left her feeling degraded and powerless. Jasmine's trembling voice, filled with both fear and courage, resonated deeply with Ava. "I felt like I was invisible," Jasmine confessed, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Like my rights didn't matter." Listening to Jasmine, Ava felt a profound sorrow that mingled with a fierce determination. It was one thing to fight for justice from behind a desk. It was another to confront the human toll of systemic failure head-on. As the days turned into weeks, Ava's investigation evolved into a relentless pursuit of truth. She began to correlate the internal complaints against Officer Cole with similar incidents in neighboring precincts. Using her expertise in legal research and her innate ability to connect disparate pieces of evidence, Ava uncovered a disturbing pattern. Incidents of excessive force, unwarranted detentions, and blatant abuses of power were not isolated to one officer or one precinct. They were symptomatic of a broader malaise affecting the entire department. Her evenings were no longer spent in quiet solitude. Instead, Ava found herself at countless after-hours meetings, poring over case files with dedicated lawyers and even journalists who had been following the ripple effects of the trial. One such journalist, Marcus Reed, a seasoned reporter known for his uncompromising coverage of corruption, became an invaluable ally. Marcus provided Ava with access to archived news stories and eyewitness accounts, helping her construct a timeline that linked past grievances to present-day abuses. With each new discovery, the magnitude of the problem became undeniable. It was as if the layers of indifference and obfuscation were being peeled away, revealing a systemic problem that had festered for years. In the midst of these long, grueling days, Ava also found solace in moments of quiet reflection. Late one night, as rain pattered softly against her office window, she sat alone with a cup of lukewarm coffee and allowed herself to process the emotional weight of her work. The evidence before her was not just paper and statistics. It was the story of real people whose lives had been upended by unchecked power. Every file was a testament to their resilience and their unyielding hope for change. And every piece of evidence Ava uncovered reinforced her belief that this fight was not just professional. It was deeply personal. The investigation soon caught the attention of the Internal Affairs team at the Department of Justice. Their initial review, spurred by Ava's meticulous documentation, confirmed that there were indeed systemic irregularities in Sergeant Gray's unit. A task force was assembled to conduct a full-scale audit, and Ava was invited to present her findings as a subject matter expert. Standing before a panel of stern-faced officials in a sterile conference room, she laid out her evidence with clarity and conviction. Charts, timelines, and photographs of internal memos painted a damning portrait of institutional neglect. The room was silent as Ava spoke, each word resonating with the gravity of someone who had sacrificed comfort for the sake of justice. Despite the professional rigor of the proceedings, Ava could not ignore the personal stakes. Every moment of her investigation was a reminder of the fragile trust between the people and the institutions meant to serve them. The emails, the meeting notes, the community testimonies, they all converged into one undeniable truth. The system needed to change, and change could only come when accountability was no longer an afterthought. One crisp morning, as autumn began to brush the outskirts of Atlanta with hints of gold and crimson, Ava received an email that would mark a turning point. The subject line read, "Preliminary audit findings. Urgent review required." With trembling hands, she opened the attachment to find a comprehensive report that not only validated her concerns, but also pointed to a disturbing trend of covered-up misconduct within multiple precincts. The report recommended immediate corrective actions and the appointment of an independent oversight committee. As she read, Ava felt a surge of emotions, relief that her efforts were bearing fruit, a solemn sadness for all those who had suffered in silence, and a renewed determination to press forward until justice was not just a word but a reality. The report also revealed that several cases, previously dismissed or buried under bureaucratic red tape, were now slated for reopening. Among them was a case that had long haunted the community, a wrongful detention incident involving an elderly man whose dignity had been trampled. The rediscovery of this case served as both a vindication of Ava's work and a stark reminder of the human cost of systemic failure. In a final act of defiance against a system built on complacency, Ava organized a press conference to share the findings with the public. Standing before a sea of reporters and community leaders outside the historic Magnolia Courthouse in downtown Atlanta, she spoke with a voice that was both commanding and compassionate. "This report," she declared, "confirms what many of us have known for far too long. Our system is broken, but today marks the beginning of its healing. Every story, every complaint, every cry for justice matters. And together, we will ensure that those in power are held accountable for their actions." As the cameras flashed and reporters jotted down her every word, Ava looked into the crowd and saw hope rekindling in the eyes of those who had once been silenced. It was a moment of collective catharsis, a turning point that signaled the potential for a future where justice was not a privilege of the few, but a right for all. What aspect of Ava's investigation do you find most compelling? The meticulous gathering of evidence, the personal stories of those affected, or her fearless public stand? Share your thoughts below. In the weeks following Ava Walker's courageous press conference and the damning internal audit, the city of Atlanta was gripped by an undercurrent of anticipation and change. The weight of revelations and the determined voices of community advocates had set in motion a series of events that would soon culminate in a public reckoning. As the case against Officer Cole and Sergeant Mitchell Gray transitioned from internal reviews to a formal trial, the atmosphere in the courtroom and the city alike shifted. Hope mingled with anxiety, and the promise of accountability hung in the air like a fragile truce. The trial was held at the Grand Magnolia Courthouse, a building that, for decades, had stood as a symbol of law and order. Now, however, its stately facade bore the marks of a system forced to confront its own failings. Journalists, legal experts, activists, and ordinary citizens filled the gallery, their eyes fixed on the proceedings with a shared urgency. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs of anticipation, each person aware that the outcome here would have far-reaching implications for police accountability and justice in Atlanta. At the helm of the trial was Judge Elena Rivera, a seasoned jurist known for her balanced yet resolute approach. Her calm demeanor and keen eyes exuded an air of authority that left no doubt. This trial was as much about restoring public trust as it was about adjudicating individual wrongdoing. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out its case. Ava Walker, now more than just a victim of an unjust arrest, but a symbol of resilience and unwavering integrity, took the stand once again. Her testimony, already etched in the public's memory from the previous trial phase, was even more impassioned today. With a voice that combined both the weight of her personal experience and the collective pain of a community betrayed by authority, she recounted the sequence of events in meticulous detail. "Your Honor," Ava began, her eyes scanning the courtroom, "the evidence we have presented is not isolated to a single incident. It is a manifestation of a pervasive pattern of abuse, negligence, and systemic corruption. Today, we are not only seeking justice for myself, but for every individual whose voice has been stifled by those who were entrusted with our safety." Her words resonated deeply with everyone present, stirring a palpable tension in the room. The prosecution then introduced a series of exhibits: body cam footage that captured Officer Cole's unwarranted aggression, internal memos that laid bare the dismissive attitude of Sergeant Gray, and testimonies from numerous witnesses, some of whom had suffered quietly until now. Each piece of evidence was a strike against a system that had long allowed its own to act with impunity. Witness after witness took the stand, each testimony building upon the last like bricks in a dam set to burst. Community activists recounted stories of similar abuses, and former victims spoke with raw emotion about the fear and humiliation they had endured. One testimony, in particular, struck a chord. A middle-aged man tearfully described how a seemingly minor traffic stop had escalated into a nightmarish ordeal, leaving him traumatized and disillusioned. His voice trembled as he recalled the scene, the fear in his eyes mirroring the collective anguish of those who had lost faith in the justice system. As the trial progressed, the defense mounted its arguments. Officer Cole and Sergeant Gray's legal teams argued that their actions were within the bounds of standard procedure, and that the disciplinary records and internal reviews were merely bureaucratic formalities, misinterpreted by an overzealous prosecution. They contended that the evidence was selectively presented and that external factors were responsible for the escalation. Yet, every point they made was met with meticulous cross-examinations by Ava and her legal team, who dismantled their claims with precision and unwavering conviction. A particularly tense moment came when Ava questioned a key witness from the Internal Affairs Task Force. Under her relentless scrutiny, the witness hesitated before admitting that multiple complaints against Officer Cole had been dismissed without proper investigation, an admission that not only corroborated Ava's claims but also underscored the systemic failure within the department. The courtroom was silent as the implications of this revelation sank in. It was a stark, undeniable confirmation that the culture of negligence and cover-ups was deeply rooted. Throughout the trial, Ava's presence was magnetic. Her calm yet powerful demeanor and articulate expression of the truth captivated the gallery. Her testimony was not just a recounting of events. It was a rallying cry for reform, a demand that the scales of justice be recalibrated in favor of accountability. She spoke of the cost of silence, of the lives shattered by unchecked power, and of the collective need to ensure that no one else would have to endure such indignities. Judge Rivera, presiding with measured gravity, listened intently as the arguments unfolded. At one point, she interjected, "The evidence presented in this courtroom today speaks to more than individual misconduct. It reveals an institutional malaise that has allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. The responsibility to act is not solely on the shoulders of the accused, but on every element of our system that has failed to protect the rights of its citizens." Her words echoed through the room, a reminder that the quest for justice was a shared endeavor. After days of rigorous testimonies, heated exchanges, and the relentless presentation of evidence, the moment of reckoning arrived. The jury, having absorbed every detail with solemn attention, retreated to deliberate. The tension outside the courtroom was palpable. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, aware that the forthcoming verdict would either mark a pivotal step towards reform or cement a legacy of injustice. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom fell into a hushed silence. The foreman stood and addressed the judge. "We, the jury, find Officer Cole guilty of misconduct and abuse of power, and Sergeant Gray guilty of dereliction of duty and obstruction of justice." A wave of murmurs swept through the room, a mixture of relief, vindication, and a cautious optimism for the future. Judge Rivera's face was impassive as she prepared to pronounce the final sentence. In a measured tone that balanced firmness with the need for reflection, she stated, "Officer Cole and Sergeant Gray, your actions have not only violated the trust placed in you by the public, but have also contributed to a culture that undermines the very foundation of our justice system. In light of the overwhelming evidence and the profound impact of your actions on countless lives, you are hereby sentenced to significant penalties, and your cases will be referred for further criminal review. Let this verdict serve as a clarion call. Abuse of power, in any form, will not be tolerated." As the gavel struck, a collective sigh seemed to sweep through the courtroom. For many, it was a moment of long-awaited justice, a symbolic beginning to the dismantling of systemic corruption. For Ava, it was a bittersweet victory. While the verdict affirmed the truth she had fought so hard to reveal, she knew that this was only a part of a much larger battle. The outcome would set a precedent, but the deep-seated issues would require continual vigilance and systemic reform. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate. Crowds gathered, voices raised in a mix of celebration and somber reflection. Community leaders hailed the verdict as a milestone in the struggle for police accountability, and local news outlets buzzed with analyses and opinions. Yet, amid the celebratory atmosphere, Ava remained contemplative. She understood that while the trial's outcome was a significant victory, it was also a reminder of the pervasive challenges that lay ahead in rebuilding a system marred by decades of neglect. In the days that followed, discussions about the verdict ignited further debates on reform policies, leading to increased scrutiny of law enforcement practices across the city. Public pressure mounted on local authorities to implement changes, stricter oversight, improved training, and transparent procedures that would prevent such abuses in the future. Ava continued to work tirelessly, collaborating with reform advocates, policymakers, and community members to ensure that the momentum generated by this trial was not lost. As the sun set on a day that would be remembered as a turning point in Atlanta's ongoing struggle for justice, Ava stood before a mirror in her modest apartment. Her reflection, marked by the fatigue of relentless effort yet illuminated by the fire of determination, symbolized the promise of a future where accountability and integrity would prevail. She knew that each step forward was a testament to the courage of every individual who had dared to speak out against injustice. How do you feel this verdict might influence future reforms in law enforcement, and what changes would you like to see implemented? Share your thoughts below. In the weeks that followed the historic verdict, Atlanta experienced a transformation that went far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The judgment against Officer Cole and Sergeant Gray had ignited a fire of reform, sweeping through the community like a long-awaited dawn after a dark night. For Ava Walker, the victory in court was not an endpoint but rather the catalyst for a larger, enduring mission. A mission to rebuild trust, demand accountability, and reimagine a system that had for too long been plagued by corruption and abuse. The city's streets buzzed with conversations about justice and change. Public forums, community meetings, and local media interviews filled the calendar. As the community celebrated the verdict, there was an unmistakable sense that the scales of power were finally beginning to balance. Protesters, community leaders, and even previously disillusioned law enforcement officers found themselves united by the common goal of ushering in a new era, one defined by transparency, accountability, and a renewed commitment to protecting the rights of every citizen. Ava, who had become a symbol of steadfast resolve, was now at the center of this transformative movement. Her relentless pursuit of truth and justice had inspired others to speak up about their own experiences with systemic failings. At town hall meetings and panel discussions, she urged community members and officials alike to engage in honest dialogue about the future of law enforcement in Atlanta. "We must learn from our past," she would say, her voice carrying both compassion and resolve, "and build a future where every act of authority is tempered with respect, empathy, and a true commitment to the rule of law." In response to the overwhelming public demand for reform, city officials and state legislators began drafting comprehensive policy changes. New oversight committees were established, bringing together community representatives, legal experts, and independent monitors tasked with ensuring that law enforcement agencies operated with full transparency. Mandatory training programs emphasizing de-escalation techniques, cultural competency, and ethical behavior were introduced, aiming to reshape the institutional culture from within. One of the most significant initiatives was the formation of the Atlanta Civil Justice Coalition, a diverse group that included community activists, former victims of police misconduct, legal professionals, and concerned citizens. This coalition was charged with overseeing the implementation of reforms, ensuring that changes were not merely cosmetic but were deeply embedded in the practices and policies of the police department. Their meetings, held in community centers and local halls, were vibrant with ideas, debates, and the collective determination to prevent future injustices. Ava worked closely with the coalition, lending her expertise and firsthand experience. Together, they reviewed countless case files, crafted recommendations, and strategized ways to foster a more accountable and responsive system. In a heartfelt address during one of the coalition's inaugural meetings, she remarked, "This is not just about correcting past wrongs. It's about creating a legacy of justice that future generations can rely on." As the reform process unfolded on a broader scale, Ava's own journey took on new dimensions. The personal toll of her ordeal, the indignity of the arrest, the isolation felt in the moment, and the long, painful hours of investigation had all been transformed into a powerful narrative of resilience and hope. Her story was featured in numerous national news outlets, inspiring other women, minorities, and advocates for justice across the country. She was invited to speak at conferences and universities, sharing not only the details of her experience but also the lessons learned about the importance of standing up for one's rights, no matter how daunting the odds. Yet, amid these successes, Ava never lost sight of the personal cost of the battle. There were quiet moments when the weight of responsibility felt almost unbearable, a silent reflection during long nights in her office, or a brief pause while watching the city lights from her apartment balcony. In these moments, she would remind herself that the struggle for justice was never a solitary endeavor. It was the sum of countless small acts of bravery, compassion, and persistence, each one contributing to the larger mosaic of societal change. Her close friend and fellow advocate, Rachel, often reminded her, "Every step you take, Ava, inspires someone to take a step of their own. Your courage is the spark that lights the fire of reform." These words, spoken during a quiet coffee break after a long day of meetings, fueled her determination to press on, even when the road ahead seemed steep and uncertain. Despite the groundbreaking reforms and the palpable sense of progress, the road to complete renewal was not without its obstacles. Some within the police force resisted the sweeping changes, clinging to old ways and entrenched power structures. There were subtle acts of defiance, quiet whispers in the corridors of the police headquarters, and bureaucratic delays that threatened to stall the momentum. But with every setback, the voices of the people grew louder, and the calls for accountability became impossible to ignore. Internal affairs, now bolstered by the reforms and the newfound vigilance of community oversight, continued to investigate and hold accountable those who breached the public trust. Cases that had once been dismissed or hidden away were reopened, and new standards were imposed that required every officer to undergo regular reviews of their conduct. The Independent Oversight Committee, comprised of diverse members with deep ties to the community, became a powerful force in ensuring that justice was not merely a lofty ideal, but a practical reality. In one particularly poignant moment, Ava received a letter from a young man who had suffered from an unjust encounter with law enforcement years ago. In his handwritten note, he expressed gratitude for her tireless work and described how her courage had helped him find the strength to come forward and seek justice for his own case. This letter, simple yet profound, reminded Ava of the human impact of her mission, the lives transformed by the relentless pursuit of truth and fairness. As autumn deepened into a season of change, the city of Atlanta began to embrace a new reality. The reforms, though still in their early stages, promised a future where every citizen's voice could be heard, where accountability was more than just a buzzword, and where the power of the people could genuinely check the power of authority. Ava, now recognized as one of the leading figures in the movement for justice, continued to work with unyielding determination. She traveled across the state, engaging with community groups, delivering impassioned speeches, and tirelessly advocating for policies that would safeguard civil rights. Her efforts were not without personal sacrifice, but the knowledge that each action contributed to a more equitable society sustained her through the darkest moments. The journey towards complete reform was long and fraught with challenges, but it was a journey that the people of Atlanta, and indeed the entire nation, were now ready to embark upon together. With every new policy enacted, every officer held accountable, and every community empowered, the legacy of that fateful day in which justice was served would only grow stronger. As the city prepared for a new chapter, Ava Walker stood at the forefront of a movement that was reshaping not just institutions, but hearts and minds. The once daunting corridors of power were now being transformed by the collective will of a community united in its demand for fairness, dignity, and true justice. What do you believe is the most important change needed to ensure lasting reform in law enforcement? And how can each of us contribute to that transformation? Share your thoughts below. As we close this chapter, remember that every act of courage and compassion is a step towards a brighter, more just future. Let the love for truth and justice guide you, and know that together, we can build a world where every voice is cherished and every heart is uplifted. Thank you for being part of this journey. Your support means everything. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and unite us all.